Welcome to Bangalore International Centre, a platform for informed dialogue, arts and culture. BIC Talks, our podcast, brings ideas and conversations ever closer to you.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. We always need credible journalism and reportage in India, and we need it more than ever during a pandemic and in a lockdown. But this new crisis is one that hasn't spared news media, and its effects are already visible. Journalist Mr. Krishna Prasad joins us from Mysore today to help us understand the present and the possible future of news and print media in India. Krishna Prasad was the editor-in-chief of Outlook magazine from 2012 to 2016, but for many of us, we know his work better than his name. Since 2006, Krishna Prasad has been the person behind Churumuri, Indian Journalism Review and Kosambari, some of India's most popular and insightful blogs. More recently, he has started JPod, a podcast on Indian journalism and its future. Visit churumuri.blog or the Bangalore International Centre website for links to the podcast, which has featured over 17 conversations on journalism so far. Mr. Krishna Prasad, welcome to BIC Talk.
Thank you very much, Pavan. Great to be here.
Today, I am very happy to hand over the mic and the anchoring to Ravichandar, who will be our primary anchor for this conversation. You'll see me chime in occasionally. Ravi, over to you.
Thanks, Pavan. Thanks, Krishna Prasad, for doing this session. And I can't think of someone more qualified to talk about the state of media and journalism, both in India as well as overseas, than someone like you. I want to address this whole issue through the lens of COVID-19. There were fault lines that were already emerging in media, more particularly in print media. From your vantage point, Krishna Prasad, what has COVID-19 done to the print media industry? As someone who gets newspapers, I have noticed that there are no more ads visible in the papers. The number of pages have come down. But from an industry perspective, what challenges are the print houses facing?
Great to be here, Ravi, and thank you for asking me to do this. To give you a one-line answer to all the points you've raised, Indian media was essentially clinically dead for quite some time, in my view. It may be a very biased view, but it was clinically dead. There was a process of atrophying that had started happening. And I think what you're seeing is an expedition of that process. The embalming has really begun in a certain sort of way.
So what has traditionally been the problem has got accentuated during the pandemic. And I think one other issue which businesses have been facing is the customs duty on newsprint. I think it came down from 10% to 5%. But with the declining rupee, I think the pressure on that front continues. Would that be right, Krishna Prasad?
Well, very much so. The Indian Newspaper Society, which is a society of at least 800 newspaper owners from across the country, INS has been repeatedly petitioning the government of Mr. Narendra Modi to lower customs duty on newsprint, imported newsprint. That was initially pegged at 10% customs duty. That has been lowered to 5%. But INS wants it even lower down to 0%, frankly. But, the Indian Newspaper Society, like most industry bodies, whether journalistic or otherwise, is very, very, concerned about its own issues. So it wants a tax holiday, it wants a customs duty cut, it wants an increase in advertising rates, and so on and so forth. So newsprint, to answer your specific question, is an issue, but it's not a huge issue at this point of time. Certainly, they're using this moment, the industry bodies, to basically drive home whatever they want to achieve. But I think that this is constantly an issue with the Newspaper Society and with other industry bodies. And newsprint, as we speak, has an additional issue. I don't know if you're aware of this. Because of the lockdown caused by COVID, what's happened is that the transport of newsprint has been affected. So one of the reasons why many newspapers are now 10 pages or 12 pages or even 8 pages in some cities is because they're all trying to play safe. They don't know when their next consignment of newsprint is going to come or where from, because most of this newsprint comes from countries like Russia and Canada and, even from, Southeast Asia. So what's happened is that because of the lockdown and because of all these barriers of entry, new newspaper owners and magazine owners are not very sure as to where their newsprint will come from. So they're playing it safe. For sure, I know one newspaper group which is actually having just about 10 or 12 days of newsprint stock as we speak. So, it's a very complicated issue, this newsprint issue, but for sure, the society, the INS wants it lower down.
Now, in a response to this, I would think that if you're publishing fewer pages, there is a certain amount of cost saving on that front. So the top line is impacted by fewer ads and lower circulation. But at the same time, one would think that fewer pages will imply lower costs. So how are print houses addressing the current challenge in terms of, are you seeing layoffs? Are you seeing salary cuts? What is the model by which the print houses are getting a handle on the cost of doing the business?
Well, Ravi, all of what you have said has happened already. There have been salary cuts across newspapers, from the Indian Express to the Hindu to even Deccan Herald in some ways. Various newspapers and various TV companies and various websites have already gone in for salary cuts. Two, many newspapers have actually laid off people too, especially in the non-English markets where it's less professional and less systematic, the processes. There has been a fair few layoffs. There have been shutdowns also. Some newspapers, especially a Hindi newspaper in Bombay, Nashik and Pune has shut down. One of the newspapers from Mysore, a very profitable old newspaper, has actually suspended its publication for the next few days, waiting for this to be lifted. And also you've seen a whole lot of publications just go online during this period so that they don't have to face these issues. But the key question that remains in the minds of many journalistic employees and unions is whether this is actually motivated by COVID, prompted by COVID, or whether these were just business decisions that some of these companies were waiting to take. Because the charge, as always in this country, is led by the biggest market players. The biggest market players, the most profitable companies start this process, and eventually everybody down the line gets the message and everybody follows. So that's a key question that's always in people's minds, whether this is really prompted by COVID or this is just one of those things that people wanted to do anyway to keep right-sizing all the time. But the issue of top line is a more interesting question. It's just not simply a question of publishing 8 pages and 10 pages and therefore being cost effective. It's not quite so, because Indian newspapers are generally so low priced. Just about 3 or 4 rupees is what you pay per copy. That copy costs well over 10 rupees or 12 rupees for a 16-page newspaper to be printed. So you are not getting money from advertising. You're not getting money from circulation because you don't know if you will reach the reader. So the issue is a more complicated one, because now you still need staff to service these newspapers, to produce these newspapers. Many of them are doing it from home, of course, but you still need staff to produce these newspapers, and they have to be paid at the end of the month. We are already on the second day of May. So what you'll find is that many publishers will now be wondering as to how will they pay for the next month, which is, let's say, June or July. So what you're seeing is not such a very easy question. The top line certainly is now kind of slightly balanced because of fewer pages and fewer ads and fewer copies to be sold. But the issue at the end is you still have overheads. You have, employees, you have, rentals to pay, etc., etc. So it's not so easily taken care of. At this point of time, cash flow is really affected in all newspapers, magazines, and TV companies hugely. So most people do not know how they'll pay salaries. This month might be okay, but most of them do not know how they'll pay salaries or how they'll take care of proceedings in the next couple of months, because we are still now facing the impact of March or early April. But we've been through a whole month of lockdown, April. So how will that impact in May and June and July? So I think the top line is a very complicated issue at this time. There's no retail advertising of any kind. The only few ads you see are obituaries and maybe some 3 or 4 government ads. And those government ads pay very little money, and you don't know when that money will come. And one last point, I might still be producing a 10 or 12 page newspaper. I might still be delivering it to your doorstep. But you might not be receiving it because your apartment block might not allow it, or you might yourself claim that you have not received this copy. So there is a billing issue. So there's lots of multiple layers of issues here. But I think the sum and substance is that, really it's tough times.
In fact, it is complicated, as you say. And I've also seen a video doing the rounds where somebody is ironing his newspaper before he reads it. Moving on, you mentioned the thing about the need to pay more or need to realize more. You mentioned 12 rupees per print edition versus realization of 4 rupees. So print houses have tried to go digital, and internationally, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, in a sense, have cracked the paywall model online. In India, from what I know, Business Standard has been reasonably successful. I think Hindu has gone more behind a paywall to some extent. What has been the experience of people, the current legacy houses, trying to go online and monetize a bit of their revenue through online resources? What has been the evidence so far?
Well, the evidence so far is very slim to arrive at any conclusion. For sure, the big market players, which means the Times of India, the Hindustan Times, etc., they have generally believed in providing content free because their model is built on a very different kind. So therefore, the evidence is not very thick for us to arrive at any conclusion. But papers like the Hindu have tried this. But you should look at more than these English language newspapers. You should look at a publication called Ananda Vigadan, which is the Tamil magazine set up by S.S. Vasan 94 years ago. Ananda Vigadan has been paid for 15 years now. And frankly, they have had some success. So you can see some success with companies which are done this. But I think at the end of this all, I think the issue really is a very fundamental one. Is the content in the publication you're receiving at home, whether it's a newspaper or a magazine or even a website, is the content that you get so world class that you want to pay for it? I think it will come down to that because you see, if you contrast what's happening in India as we speak today, the contrast with the West is very, very clear and apparent. Look at what's happening to the Atlantic Monthly in the US. They've had a spike in circulation in the last few months or for the last few weeks. Look at the New York Times newsletter. They service 17 million people every morning through that newsletter. Look at the BBC, which is a public service broadcaster in the UK. They have seen soaring readership and viewership in the last few weeks because of COVID. In fact, many people argue that the BBC, which was on the block because of Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, the BBC has been saved by COVID. And look at something like the Boston Globe. Last Sunday, the Boston Globe's cover price was $6. If you translate that into the rupees, that's more than 400 rupees. So what you see is that we are, all the chickens are coming home to roost for Indian journalism. You have really dumped down in hugely. You have infantilized journalism. You have really taken your eye off the ball. You really spent a whole lot of time trivializing journalism by not asking good questions, by basically just being a happy house for advertisers, and the lowest common denominator. And all those chickens are coming home to roost for India because you now find that you don't have the kind of content for which people will pay. And more than that, there are various options available before readers if they really want to, get good content. So I think this issue of whether digital is the way forward is a complicated one. Again, like everything in our life, this is also complicated. Let me give you a small example. I used to read about 25 to 30 newspapers every day. When I say read, I mean at least look at those papers. Now I get the whole world's newspapers through PDF files by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I get hundreds of newspapers and magazines. So what you find is that the Indian publications are coming into this digital age a little too late in terms of pricing. And I think what's also happened is that people who want to actually give that content to you free by turning into PDF files or so on, there are so many out there. And they have found ways and they're 2 steps ahead of Indian publishers. So what you will find again is that the Indian Newspaper Society or Indian publishers are really on the back foot even on this front. So to me, it looks very bleak, this whole digital future. I mean, I know that there are examples of Business Standard and Caravan magazine and the Hindu, but you really wonder as to what these numbers are. This is not quite the same situation in the New York Times. The New York Times actually makes more money through digital ventures now than through the print newspaper. Look at what's also happened in these last 3-4 weeks. The New York Times today offers to an Indian reader for 1 week, you get New York Times at ₹15, which means per month you pay about 60 rupees per month, which means the New York Times is coming to you, the world's greatest newspaper is coming to you to your phone at 2 rupees per day. So what's happening is that Indian publishers are really caught in this really funny situation where they have not invested enough in journalism, not invested in hardcore journalism. They have just been very happy generating these very bogus numbers by underpricing, by dumping, and so on. So I think all those chickens are coming home to roost, and you find that there is very little market in the end for this kind kind of stuff.
So Krishna Prasad, so if there is going to be a race to the bottom on prices and the dumbed down journalism that you mentioned, that is going to put even more pressure on the others who may not have the deep pocket. And therefore, the ability to realize a better price is going to be difficult. And therefore, the ability to give better journalism is going to be impacted. Would I be right in my assessment?
Well, certainly to a large part, yes, because I think what you're going to see besides all these salary cuts and job cuts and so on is that you will find in the next few months and maybe a couple of years, you'll find greater consolidation within the Indian media, which means that in most markets, the number 4 or number 5 player, whether it's print or television, will be knocked off, or it'll merge, or it'll be bought over. So you'll find greater consolidation. You will also see evidence of this in some of the petitions that the INS, the Indian Newspaper Society, has made. See, everyone is trying to protect his turf at this point of time. So the Indian Newspaper Society, when it first went to Nirmala Sitharaman asking for a tax holiday, also included a paragraph against Chinese aggregator, news aggregator. And I'll quote to you. It said just one Chinese news aggregator has 10 times more subscribers than the readership of all English dailies combined, unquote. That was the quote in the INS petition on this issue. So what you find is that everyone is now trying to really, protect his own turf. For the last few days, many newspapers across the country have been writing editorials demanding that, aggregators like Google and Facebook also pay them for the content. And suddenly in the midst of all this, Facebook ties up with Jio, so that throws a new ball into the arena. So what you find, therefore, is that this issue of consolidation will happen. You will find that the big players in the big markets will survive. They'll find new ways of, generating business and, keeping themselves in circulation. But you will consistently find journalism under question in India because of the track we've taken in the last few years. Let's not forget just this one simple fact. On the World Press Freedom Index, India has consistently fallen every year in 2015. And you know the significance of that year. Since 2015, it's fallen from 136 to 138, 138 to 140, and we are now 142 last week. Do let me know how many of our newspapers actually published the fact that we were 142 on this list. So what's happening is that the more we start to depend on government advertising to keep ourselves in the business, the more we feel obliged to keep the government in good books. So therefore, not even putting out stuff like this, that the fact that we are slipping rapidly on the Freedom Index is a reflection of the path we've taken. It's a reflection of what is in store for us. And frankly, when I look at this, it really, really troubles me. On this day as we speak, the biggest, the toughest, the hardest questions are being asked, not of the ruling party, but of the opposition. Even today as we speak, one of India's best known business journalists has the biggest questions for Rahul Gandhi, but not for Narendra Modi. Okay, so what it tells you is that we are slipping into a mode from which there will be no rescue for us. They will, of course, it's not as if newspapers are going to end. It's not as if magazines will not be published. They will survive. But what kind of role will they play for us is something which will be really under question in the next few weeks and months.
So the point, Krishna Prasad, you're making is journalism's primary job or role is to hold truth to power. That is getting compromised for a combination of reasons, one of which is the dependence on government for ads and the like, is what you're mentioning. In this, I also have a related question. Is the pain finally being felt more in the vernacular media or the English media? And is the bending over happening more in the vernacular media or the English media?
That's a very good question, Ravi, because I think we must talk a lot more about the language media. In my own podcast, I've really spoken to a lot of people across languages because I think that's where the soul of Indian journalism exists. And what you find is that your point is underlined. While we must be alarmed at the way English journalism has gone, I think it's even more tragic in the case of the languages. And there is no exception except maybe Malayalam in some ways. And what you find is that whether it's Hindi or Marathi or Kannada or Bengali, you find that language media is being ravaged first by the commercial issues, which is prompted by COVID, but also by professional issues, which means you have really compromised owners and compromised editors and compromised journalists. And what you find, therefore, is that at this critical point in this country's history, at the cusp of one of the greatest tragedies we have seen in our lives, what you find is that the language media is performing a really meek role. And that is really at the core of this whole thing of government advertising. the language media depends more on government advertising than the English newspapers. The English newspapers still get corporate ads, they get retail ads, they get local ads. But what you find with language media across the country in all languages is that they depend hugely on government advertising to survive, to pay their salaries and so on and so forth. So they are very amenable to any kind of pressure. They are very amenable, they are very gullible, they are very vulnerable to all of this. And perhaps they're also susceptible, and perhaps they wanted themselves to be these mouthpieces of authority. So what you find is that language media has played a key role. Just let's look at one language, which is Hindi. Look at the role Hindi has played, Hindi journalism, print and television, in communalizing COVID. Who would have thought that in a moment like this, communalization of a disease would be the primary task of media? But that's what it's come down to. And that's because this has now become such an embedded part of modern day politics. These compromised newspapers and television stations and TV anchors and presenters, some of whom we publicly kind of celebrate, but frankly are pathetic when it comes to their professional tasks. What you find is this kind of communalization, this kind of hatred being sown even at this moment. And all of these issues are getting reflected. Of course, there are salary cuts, job cuts, shutdowns, etc., even in those language publications and TV houses. But I think net, their professional output has gone even worse than in the past. It was always questionable, but I think they have just stopped asking any kind of questions. They are basically handouts. They are megaphones for all kinds of majoritarianism. And frankly, we must be very alarmed at the way Indian democracy's DNA is being kind of reshaped lower down where language readers exist.
So actually the situation, as you say, is very unfortunate. And I remember seeing a cartoon which had both the coronavirus as well as the communal virus. And the communal virus is much larger and it says, okay, you do your job now, but I'm waiting in the wings. Krishna Prasad, moving on to, there has now been the new challengers which have entered this media space as pure digital only plays. So they don't have a legacy printing press and the like. They have no legacy or history in the past. And they've come purely as digital players. So whether, there's a newsminute.com, there's a specialized thing like the Ken and the others. How do you see the pure digital players? What is the heart of their business model and how are they doing currently?
Well, Ravi, I think the simple answer for almost everything in this country is numbers. Everybody is chasing the numbers game. And you would say maybe that's just about the right thing because we are a huge country and we really need to chase numbers. So I think at this point of time, most of them are in the numbers game. Very few of them are in the pay game, as you will see. You mentioned the Ken. That's one of the few publications where you need to pay, but most of them are free. Most of them depend on institutions and foundations for grants and other kinds of donations. So it's there. But I think their role is certainly significant, but it is just so small in the scheme of things, and really, I am a huge consumer of social media. I've been a producer of social media for quite some time, in fact, for a very long time. But I find that there's a whole lot of energy online. There's great journalism being done. There are great websites, there are great people tweeting and, Facebooking and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of all of that. But at this time, we have still not found the models for them to survive. We've still not found the models for them to reach more people. As I mentioned to you earlier on, INS, for example, is very concerned about a Chinese news aggregator getting subscribers. So, you see, the economic chips of this country are being rearranged in this moment of the COVID crisis. What you find is that the media players are using this moment to strike the established legacy players. So they are striking back at Chinese news aggregators. They are striking at Facebook and Google for taking their content but not paying, etc., etc. So what you find is a whole lot of things happening where the economic chips of this industry are also being sought to be relayed. That said, there's no question that digital is the way forward. I've been saying this for 20 years now. So therefore, this is not new at all. But for 20 years, I've heard the same question. What's the business model? We don't know. Frankly, we don't know because the legacy players have not been interested in doing journalism online. What you will find, you mentioned the Newsminute or you mentioned the Wire, these are not coming from legacy outfits. None of our legacy companies are renowned for good digital journalism. All they are known for is charging for what they produce offline, or all they are doing is to put up a paywall, but they are not exclusively investing on journalism online. So you don't see the great stories that you see in a Vox or a Vice or any of those wonderful websites from the US and UK, where there's actually investments being done in digital journalism. At this point of time, it seems to be, and it seems so for quite some time to me, that legacy players in India are treating journalism like a milk cow. They just want to milk it dry and they will do whatever it takes to do that. They do not want to invest. So for example, let me just talk to you about one simple story. Let's say this migration issue that has popped up because of this COVID lockdown. Okay, we have coverage in the newspapers, we have coverage on our regular television stations. But here is my question. How many of our legacy companies have sent correspondents to travel with these people who are walking hundreds and thousands of kilometers? How many of us have sent people to capture the voices of these hungry people who today is even looking for, say, a single banana as sustenance? So what I'm trying to say is that while there is a lot of digital explosion and it will keep exploding forever, what you will find is that there's not enough investment in journalism, in hardcore journalism. All you have are stupid opinions like mine here. But you are not looking at deep dives, investigative stuff, nothing, no stuff. I mean, there's no attempt. I have done stories for some global players in my own life. We were 6 and 7 people doing a single story. There would be one from print, one from the digital side. There would be a cameraman, there would be a graphic artist, and there would be a pure play social media player working with all of them. So there is investment on these stories. Indian journalism really has to do journalism to survive. It just cannot depend on the advertising model or the numbers model. It needs to become relevant to the reader. At this time, 5 weeks after this lockdown started, articulate Indian reader is really not so worried about the absence of newspapers or the absence of magazines because he can survive without it. I think we need to do enough in our profession to make people want to come back to us. That's the only thing that will count. This might not fetch you numbers, but this is the only thing that counts in my life, at least in my perspective. Because unless you're doing something that is really something lasting, there's no point to this. And we just can't be covering celebrities and cricketers and fashion and food. I mean, these things are important in life, but your journalism cannot revolve around that.
So, KP, what you're essentially saying is we need to go back to our roots in journalism. You mentioned the migrant issue. I think someone like Barka Dutt over the last month, in a sense, through her Mojo reporting, video reporting, has gone back to her roots and done that kind of reporting, in a sense, holding a mirror to the others that this is possible. The other quick point I want to mention, and I want your reaction, is you mentioned the Wire and some of the others. The thing is, if you're critical of the system or the powers of the day, you are also harassed in a certain sense, which basically is a message to mute yourself. Is that something that you're seeing as a challenge? That how do you hold truth to power if the tools are going to be used to mute you in a certain sense? KP?
Well, it's a very good question. And unfortunately, this is where we have come to 72 years after our independence, that we have to really be worried, not just of our independence, we have to be worried about our lives. Let's not forget that we are sitting and speaking in a state where a journalist was killed at her doorstep. Okay, so therefore, this issue of people trying to silence us by various means, by trolling, by doxing, by even killing, is a live and real threat. That's the reason we are number 142 on the World Press Freedom Index. So this is a threat we'll have to live with, we'll have to find ways of dealing with. But unless we have the political leadership which wants to stand up and be statesman-like and suggest that this is not the way to go forward, unless we remove lynching from our lexicon, there is no way journalism is going to be spared from it. Unfortunately, we have now gotten trapped in this enormous maze or matrix where everything can be linked. And therefore, this fear that we in journalism have for speaking truth to power is a very real threat. And I'm very glad that you asked. And I wish I had an answer. Unfortunately, we don't. Most publishers, most digital operators, most individuals find it very easy to accept silence and to be silent, to just not talk. And we think that we are playing a very good soft game by doing so. But I think this is a very problematic issue. And the moment you start doing so, as the old Niemöller quote goes from Germany, there'll be nobody left to defend us. So I think we've come to that point where we have to really wonder about our lives and livelihood. But I think we have to, this is a consistent battle, and it's not a unique battle unique to India. This is a battle across the world. It's happening in the US, it's happening in the UK. But you find that the organizations there have the strength, the moral strength to stand up and tell the people in power that this will not do. I mean, can you imagine? Donald Trump his official press conference is no longer being covered live by all the major networks. And can you imagine anything like that happening in India? You will not, because we don't have those legal laws backing us. We don't have the institutional support backing us. You don't have industry bodies supporting us. You don't have the regulatory authorities supporting us. We are basically trying to do journalism in a bit of a vacuum in this country at this point of time. So therefore, the only journalism which sells and which survives is the soft, clean, hurt nobody, displease nobody kind of journalism. But for a democracy to develop, for a democracy to flower, you need the people who will say the things that are not to be said. You need people who will go outside the script from the straight and narrow and say things as is. Unfortunately, you don't find that. You don't find the critical questioning that is so important for us. And that goes for almost 99.99% of everything you see, print, television, or digital.
KP, there's another question given your past life as the editor of Outlook. What's happening to the weekly magazines? Because with news being consumed by the hour, even by the minute, what's the scene for the weekly news magazines, print magazines? What's happening there? Quick word on that.
I think it's going to be very tough. It's been tough for quite some time. Magazines, of course, have their own place, which is very different from newspapers. They are more expensive. They are more classy. They are differently produced. Their periodicity is different. Their utility is different. Their shelf life is different. That said, what you will find with COVID and with digital explosion, I hope you know that we've seen a nearly 75-80% jump in social media use in the last few weeks. What you will find is that these magazines, whether they're weeklies or monthlies or fortnightlies, will have trouble. Taranga, which is a magazine from one of the big groups in Karnataka, has suspended publication offline. It's only offered online for the next few weeks. So you will find all these pressures, and I think you will find advertising pressures of an even bigger sort on magazines going forward. And I would expect at least one or two of these to die in the next few years.
I mean, if I look at it from a consumer perspective, I'd like your take on the trends as to where is the market going. For example, today I want to stay with just the professional media, and we'll finally talk about the social media. So you have an option of the print daily newspaper, or the weekly news magazine. You have the option of TV. You have the option of the pure digital kind of thing from which you can consume some of the news, and maybe some from YouTube also in news form. Where do you see the market trend developing? Where is the preference for consumers? Are they hanging out more digitally and therefore that's where they're consuming it? Or is it that 9 o'clock nightly news, which is where the main news is being consumed or the opinions are being consumed? Where do you see the current trend and where do you see the future across these multiple channels?
First up, I'll say journalism will become device agnostic. It won't matter whether it's print or magazine or newspaper or website or YouTube or social media. It will become device agnostic. So you will consume it whichever way you want. You might consume it as a meme. I don't know how you will consume it, but you will consume it in any which way. What you will find is a greater lurch towards mobile phone journalism and news being consumed through the mobile phone. The mobile phone is a very interesting device. We have not examined it enough in this country or across. But look at the difference. A newspaper was thrown at your doorstep. A television sat in your living room. But the mobile phone is in your pocket. It is your personal digital device. It rings, it pings, it whispers, it sends you a haptic, etc. So there's a personal proprietary.
It will also monitor your health with Aragya.
Absolutely, and it will do a whole lot of other surveillance things which we don't know. That said, it's a personal digital news consumption device as far as I can see from a journalistic perspective. So you'll find more and more people trying to consume news through the phone, and they will consume newspapers or magazines or TV stations. But to answer the second part of your question, it's no more essential that people watch the 9 p.m. news at 9 p.m. They can watch it at 3 a.m. in the morning when they come back from their club, or they can watch it next day or next week or next month, because all of this is now streamed. All of this is now available in various platforms. So the news consumption habits changed in front of your eyes. You might consume it as a podcast. They have just changed. You might just listen to the news while working out in the gym or, taking a walk. So there is no one way in which news is going to be consumed from a consumer perspective. I think critical point, as I've said several times over and over here is this, which is how important are you about the important questions of the day? That is the one question which has to be uppermost in the minds of news producers, whether they are papers, magazines, TV stations, digital operations, whatever. Unless you're able to keep the reader, the viewer, the listener front and center of your universe, you will have a problem. But that said, it's just not about about doing just the hardcore or not just the soft things. It's also about asking all the big questions around democracy, around life, around society, around our nation and country. And we can't just keep getting into this trap over and over again.
So I think here citizens also have to play a role. Just like you're not going to get a better city till you demand a better city and better services, I think you're going to get a better set of media, news and opinions and insights, provided you're more discerning and demand it. So I think that's another thing that needs to happen. I have one other closing question to you, KP. For new people who are thinking in terms of entering the journalism field, I'm sure you interact with them, maybe you take some classes for them in journalism schools. Are they driven by a certain sense of idealism? Are they being driven by a certain sense that this is where the future in terms of opportunities lie? What are you seeing among the new journalist entries? And typically, what's the kind of advice that you give them as they are thinking about embarking on journalism as a career?
I'm so happy you asked me this question because I've taught for a very long time. And I can tell you this much, that every time I go and take classes, I find that the youngsters who are trying to get into our profession are fantastic. They are full of spunk. They are full of eagerness. They're full of spirit. They're really wanting to do something for society, for the country, for whatever they represent. But the moment they get out of college and go into these institutions, they have a problem. Because everything that they're taught, everything that they're made aware of just does not apply anymore in the Indian workplace. This is just the opposite of what you see in the US. Everywhere in the US, whichever small town, city, state you go to, everybody aspires to become the New York Times. Whether it's a college newspaper or a school newspaper or a state newspaper, everybody looks up and says, I want to be the New York Times. Unfortunately, in this country, we've got into that mode where everybody is looking downwards and saying, I want to go to the bottom of the pit. And so what's happening is that many of these young people who join journalism get quickly disillusioned. But what I find is that there is still enormous respect for journalists and journalism. There's enormous eagerness for these people to become good journalists. And as one of my friends, N. Ram of The Hindu, was saying just last week, we've seen an increased intake at ACJ this year, the Asian College of Journalism. There's been more interest in joining at the Asian College of Journalism this year. And Mr. Ram was pointing out that this was almost exactly like what had happened in the US in the 2007-2008 timeframe, when there was an economic downturn in the US. At the time of the greatest economic downturn in the US, there was more interest among people to join the Columbia School of Journalism. And that's exactly what's happening here when we have a huge pandemic, when we have huge existential issues within journalism. It seems to be that more and more people, young people, want to join journalism and they see a career in journalism. And the fact that they're looking at people like Barkha actually go down to the ground and do the kind of story she's doing will have convinced them that this is what we should do in our lives to change our country, rather than just wrapping ourselves in the tricolor or the national anthem and shouting Bharat Mata Ki Jai.
Thank you so much, KP, for that. It's very heartening to hear what you said about young budding journalists. It makes one feel optimistic about the future. Such kind of people are entering the journalism field for the right reasons. There is hope after all. KP, it's been absolutely fabulous listening to you, gaining your insights, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Ravi, and thank you, Srinath.
Thank you, both of you. I mean, there were so many questions that kept popping up in my mind, but Mr. Krishna Prasad, you were answering them even before I could articulate them. Thank you again for doing this with us. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from Sarvana Raj, and the episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. You can get our podcast on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in for new episodes every week. Check out Bangalore International Centre on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget to regularly check in on our podcasts.